welcome everybody. It's nice to have one of our Sterling majors and graduates of Brigham Young University back. Mary Cox was a Sterling major in the comparative literature department at BYU. She also did work in German while she was here. Went on to do her Master of Science in Economic History at the London School of Economics, and then finished her PhD in 2015 in Economic and Social History at Oxford, where she is right now on a British Academy postdoc fellowship. She's really accomplished in a lot of ways. It's hard to really describe somebody like Mary. She's very unique. She just has a book out, Hunger in War and Peace, published by the Oxford University Press. She's also published with Palgrave Macmillan in the Economic History Review and Pacific Studies, and has talked around and done quite a few things like that. We could talk about that forever, but I'd like to say some things that are maybe a little bit more personal about Mary, looking back over the past 12 to 15 years that I first was acquainted with her. I'd like to say in the first place that she and her sister are the best walking advertisements for good parenting that I've seen in a long time. Also, she's a thoroughly committed Latter-day Saint. I mean, thoroughly committed, not just somebody who goes to church and has a temple recommend and pays tithing, but somebody whose heart and soul is in the restoration of the gospel and all that that implies. She also knows how to work. That was one of her most sterling characteristics when she was my student in my classes. She's also a very honest person, I noticed. I've sort of watched her from a distance in the past several years. She goes about her work and the kinds of things that she does with an eye single to the things that that are part of what she is doing them in the right way, the way a Latter-day Saint and a true scholar would do them. But then the final thing that I'd like to say about Mary might sound a little cheesy to some of you, but she's actually a really nice person. Mary.
Thanks a lot for that introduction. Dr. Pierre was my honors thesis advisor and great friend. I really respect him. So it's nice to be back at BYU. Thanks for coming. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that was just published in July in this book, Hunger in War and Peace. The title is slightly different, and I'll only talk about a few things in the book. But I'm going to start by telling you a story, and then I'll add in some details to the story, and then tell you what I have contributed, hope to contribute to this debate. So 100 years ago, at the outbreak of the First World War, the British government initiated a blockade against Germany. This was made to include not only military material, but also food, agricultural produce, fertilizer. And the reason that there's been a debate about this is the effect that it may or may not have had on German civilians. I won't talk about it today, but there were legal issues regarding the right to use blockade in wartime. So over the past century, there are some who've said that this had a major impact on civilians, that women and children starved. Perhaps it even resulted in the capitulation of Germany. Others have said that these arguments were a myth, that the blockade of Germany had a negligible impact. What's been missing from the blockade or from the debate, I argue, is really any sort of empirical analysis. So if you see, when you read some of these old diaries or reports, there were certainly people in Germany who talked about being hungry, but it's been hard to know up until now if this represented just small groups of family or this was a wide-scale impact. So that's what I'll be talking today about. Some of the research that I did, I visited archives in 5 countries, so Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And it's been fascinating and fun to do this research that I've been engaged in. So here's a picture of the book. We'll move on. Just to give you a bit about some of the debates. So this is a famous historian of international affairs, Sally Marks. She argues that that it's a myth to say that Germans were super hungry, especially during the period of armistice. But these arguments also go back over the last century. So this is actually Nazi propaganda. This is from the National Socialists. This was a book published in 1940 called Krieg gegen Frauen und Kinder, War Against Women and Children. And in it, it was argued that one of the reasons why Germany won the war is because they deliberately starved women and children. However, this debate, this argument that Germans especially made that their civilians were hungry is well before the Nazis. So these are two publications, one published in 1918, one published in 1919, just talking about how hungry German civilians had been during the blockade. And it was also international. So for time, I'm just going to give you one example. This is published in Portugal. This is the second edition, Un Pueblo en la Miseria, so a house of misery. If you look at this closely, what we see is a woman holding a child whose stomach is elongated. This is obviously, it suggests that the child is starving. Behind you see a night of death. If you can make out, that's a skeleton face walking behind. You should speak in the microphone. I know this is being recorded, sorry. And when you open up this little book, I'm not going to show you the pictures, but it's full of photographs of children who are emaciated, German children who may have been starving. One reason why we get these international publications, especially starting in 1919, is that although Germany surrendered in November of 1918, the final the final peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, wasn't signed until the end of June 1919. The blockade continued until July 12, 1919 in some form. So you have 8 months of Germans continuing to suffer from this blockade. And at that point, there's a big effort and a big push to get the word out and to suggest that the blockade needed to be lifted so that their children would be hungry. So here's an example of this. This is from the Frankfurter Zeitung, and they start giving numbers in terms of total death statistics. So these are separate from the Spanish flu. Today, it's still debated how many civilians died specifically because of the blockade. It ranges from about 450,000 to 1 million. I won't be talking about total death statistics. What I'm going to be talking about are survivors. But they use this as a way, there's a lot of heat in this debate, but there's not a lot of light, or there hasn't been a lot of light. And this is taken from the second most circulated weekly newspaper in the UK. This is from September 8th, 1918, so just over 100 years ago. Make sure I get the right one. And if you look, this is the front page of the newspaper, the Huns of 1940. I'll just read this. I've never been an apostle of the comfortable theory that starvation alone will bring the Huns to their knees. The real effects of the blockade of Germany are still to be experienced by that criminal nation. By that, I mean that the undernourishment which it has suffered for the past 4 years and is still suffering will manifest itself in the years to come. And if you go down further in the article, it talks about creating a degenerate German race, and how this would be a positive thing. So there was certainly internationally in Germany, in the UK, this idea that the blockade could harm civilians. But what was the effect actually like? Let's see. So Germany was particularly vulnerable to a blockade. First of all, it imported roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of all foodstuffs from abroad. And it was also the country was heavily reliant on fertilizer. So especially the agricultural economy in the 30 years leading up to the First World War relied more and more heavily on fertilizer than any other method. So it's compared to the French per unit of land, they used roughly 3 times the amount of fertilizer on a unit of land to increase agricultural production than the French did. There's also a conflict of interest because Fritz Haber invented nitrogen fixing in 1913, meaning that the fertilizer that was available could be used for bombs instead of for fertilizer. So there's kind of a double whammy there. I also want to mention that it wasn't only the blockade. The Germans themselves also made what we could easily consider poor policy decisions. There are several. I'll just give a couple of the highlights. A very famous group of the top economists in Germany at the time and scientists came up with the plan on how to increase the food supply in Germany. And what they figured out is that humans and pigs co-competed for calories. This is what's the suggestion, as well as other livestock. And the idea was that if you could get rid of livestock by killing them, then that unit of land could then grow and produce wheat or some other grain, which would give more calories than it would to grow pigs and have to feed them for periods of years before they could grow. So pigs were the most ineffective, and then cows and then sheep. They started with pigs. So this was published as a book. It was highly influential. The government followed this policy, and 9 million hogs were destroyed in just a very short period of time, a couple of months. What ends up happening is that you have a glut of protein on the market, and then instead of the farmers, behaving as the economists predicted and growing grain in their fields, they didn't. So instead, you just have reduced protein in German society, and it was unfortunate. Another area that policy that didn't work out well is that Germany, many policymakers were worried that not everybody could afford food. So in an effort to make sure that food was affordable, they put price caps on certain foodstuffs, but not all foodstuffs. So for example, bread. The idea being if we keep bread at a low cost, everybody can afford bread. But it wasn't controlled well enough. So instead of farmers producing and selling more bread, they started producing goods that were not capped. So this is a prime example of policy that was meant to work well, but that did not. In the German government's defense, they were functioning under stress. There was a total amount of less food available in German society, but these policy measures ended up making things worse. And then finally, this was an issue for everybody across Europe. There was competition between the military and agricultural workers for both humans and for animals. Here's an example. This is nice. This is an Australian woman who was living in Leipzig, so she wrote in English about some of the qualitative evidence that we have that the Germans were hungry. This was written in 1917 by Caroline Ethel Cooper, and she talks about how cold she was. And let me just read part of this. Coal is run out, the electric light is cut off in most houses, the trams are not running, or only in the very early morning. All theaters, schools, the opera, Gewandhaus, and concerts and cinema tracks are closed. Neither potatoes nor turnips are to be had. Just to interrupt, turnips, that's what pigs ate. At the time, this wasn't considered good for human. There's cultural things related to foodstuffs, and so humans didn't normally eat turnips. But even those are not available. There is no fish, and Germany has at last ceased to trumpet the fact that it can't be starved out. Added to that, the thermometer outside my kitchen window says 24 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. I've never seen that before. If you think about calories, I'll get into this in a few minutes, but we need calories in order to move and walk and read. But also, if you're sick, you need extra calories to fight off those diseases. If you're cold, your body uses extra calories to keep you warm. So what's interesting, I used this statement by Caroline because she's not only hungry, but she's also cold, which means that there's no coal, so people would have been using even more calories than normal. One way we can get at this, and what I'm going to introduce you today, I'm going to make the assumption that many of you maybe don't know about anthropometrics. If you do, then bear with me. You can smile and feel confident that you already know this. But it's an interdisciplinary field which a lot of people don't know about. It's called anthropometrics. The basic idea is that if we look at changing heights of populations over time, that can give us an indication of their well-being. So economists use this often if there's some reason to think that income estimates might be problematic. For example, we use it, it's been used a lot in this country, looking at slaves, looking at immigrants. So if you have, and I say population because that matters, if you have a population where the height is increasing or decreasing, that tells us something about their well-being, about their diet, about the disease environment that they might be living in. One tool within this that I find very useful is looking at children. The reason why is that not all, but most anthropometrics uses conscription data, so data on soldiers. That's because it's readily available. If you do that, though, you're often only getting certain types of people. The biggest one is that you're getting males, because women have not fought in the military historically. Another issue is that very often, unless you have universal conscription, most often you don't get elites that are fighting in the military, at least enough to make a big impact. So you have lower class, poor people that are in that. And then also, if you're using conscription data, then whatever your estimates are that you're making, you're looking back in time to try to figure out when the changes happened. If you look at children, and you have boys and girls, which I do in my study, then I'm getting males and females. I know I can pinpoint the exact time of deprivation. And also, I'm able to look at children from all different social backgrounds, different social classes. This is because schooling in Germany was universal some 30 years before the war began. And so everybody had to go to school. If parents had a little bit of money, they would send them to a better school. If they had a lot of money, they'd send them to a school where they would be studying Greek and or Latin and art and they'd be prepared for university, or if they were for a woman for a fancy lifestyle, I guess. So children, when they went to school, they would have a health assessment done every year at the beginning of the school year. And part of this included taking measurements of heights and weights. They were measured at their schools. These measurements were taken by doctors or teachers, and they're pretty precise. Some of the data that I have, they're down to the millimeter, down to 2 millimeters. What's interesting is that even though these measurements were widely taken, they were not recorded systematically in any of the official statistical records by the Reich, which is surprising. If anybody's done anything with German economic history or German statistics, it's wonderful because they collected so much data, but they didn't collect this. I'm going to just show you briefly some of the data that I used. So this is a table. If anybody knows the German academic system now, these words, the meanings have changed. This actually now, or back then it meant like upper elite schools. So here I have the age of the child down to the half year, 9 to 9.5, 9.5 to 10. Here's their height, here's their weight, and then the year that's given. If you notice, these are published, or these are typed anyway, and this one line represents an average for a school class rather than individual data, which reduces the variation somewhat. Let's see. Here's a map of the data just to show you that it's very representative of all of Germany. There's 23 different cities. So those averages that I showed you across the lines, they represent almost 2,500 school classes. The years 1914 to 1924, 11 different states, 23 locations. Again, the data is separated into these different school types, which match well onto different social classes. Children are aged 6 to 20 years. And in some, they represent almost 600,000 observations. This is essential that the data set is large, because if it wasn't, we might be worried that the variation that we're seeing is based on differences in genetics. So my mother is not here, and she's a very short but healthy but short woman. And no matter how many carrots she ate as a child, she probably wasn't going to pass 5'1". She says she's 5'1.5" round up, but she's a short lady, and that's fine. So that's why you've got to have a large sample size, because we might just be looking at, a series like hobbits in one part of the country or one family, lovely hobbits. Or she's Welsh, so I think it's okay to say that in a loving, positive way. So it's important that the data set is large enough that we can move beyond genetic variation. So that's why I showed you the map. It's all over the country. There's different types of children who are in the school in terms of their background. There's different genders, and we're beyond genetic variation. Let's see. I'm just going to show you a film. So this measurement system that was in place before the war began was used during the war, and then after the First World War, aid givers plugged into this as a way of figuring out who to feed aid to. I showed you at the beginning that book that was published in Portugal with the skeleton on the front. And these types of things were being published everywhere. So I found evidence in Sweden, across the United States. And the message was basically the same, which was German children are hungry, German women are hungry, we need food aid, we need help now. And the world responded by sending a lot of food aid. And this was filmed in Dresden by the Quakers. I have another film from them as well. And what they would do is they would take children and they plugged into the institutions that already existed before the war. So they plugged in, instead of, if you think about international aid today, I know we're at the Kennedy Center. I forgot to mention this beautiful pin that I was given. I'm definitely a supporter of the Kennedy Center. But just to relate this to things you might think about today, when you think about aid, oftentimes there's sometimes complaints about sort of imposing your aid. If you can work with local institutions, that seems to be the most effective. This is something that the Quakers did. So rather than send over their missionaries to decide who should be fed and how much they should be fed, when they would open up a feeding center, a Quaker missionary would go and he would, or she, usually it was a he, but they were also female missionaries, they would speak to, they were instructed to go and speak to the head of every major political party, business, and religious group in an area, and invite them to join with them on feeding children in their area, to form a committee. And then they plugged into this system of children being measured at schools and used that to decide who should get aid. So they used a triage system, would feed children, they'd categorize children into 4 groups, and they only had enough food to feed the bottom 2 groups. When I say enough food, the Quakers alone were feeding over 1.1 million children, German children, a day, every day of the week except for Sunday, which is incredible. Germany had a population at the time of about 60 million, and there were many other aid groups in Germany besides the Quakers. They were just the largest. So I'll show you this for a second. This girl's being examined. Undernourishment does not show its effects so much in the faces, but in the bodies. What's cool here is you can actually see what they're doing. So this is an altimeter, which is measuring this boy's height. Here, they're being weighed on a scale, and then they're being examined. Then these would have been recorded. And if you were found small enough, then you'd be given an extra meal for a month. So you'd get a feeding card, and that feeding card would be signed by the Quakers, by your school leader. It'd have your name on it, and you'd take it and show it at the feeding center. Let's see. I'm just going to show you some results from some regressions that I made. I won't show you the model itself, but my dependent variables were height, weight, height for age Z-score, and weight for age Z-score. Before I drew this cartoon to try to illustrate to you, to just make the point of what I'm doing. Regardless of everything else, the biggest indicator of a child's height was their background. If their parents were wealthy enough to send them to an elite school, then they were over 5 centimeters taller, all things equal, than normal poor kids. And if parents were rich enough to send them to a school that was a little bit expensive, then they were over 2.5 centimeters taller. And I want to emphasize this point just because there's no genetic reason that poor kids should be smaller than wealthy children. This is really showing us, the effects of a poor diet, of poor access to medical facilities and help to the disease environment. And so this was, more than anything else, this was the biggest impact. I'm going to just show a couple of graphs. They look a little bit messy, but they're important to understand. So I'm going to walk through them. I'm going to step away from the microphone, but speak with a loud voice. Is that okay? I feel a little bit trapped. So let's do this. So the way to think about this is that I'm actually showing you 3 different graphs. So weight for age Z-scores, think about this as just weight. The reason why I use a Z-score, weight for age Z-score, is that the difference of, say, a centimeter between a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old has a different meaning than the difference of 1 centimeter between a 10-year-old and an 11-year-old. So this allows me, by making Z-scores, it allows me to compare children of different ages. If we were thinking about modern standards, we would expect to see a 0 up here, and it would hover around a 0. This would be, there's no deprivation. So I'm going to go just kind of panels down through. So this top graph here, this dashed line is up here is what is the weight, I guess you could think about it, weight in 1914 before there's any impact from the war. Okay, this is the dashed line here. For elite children, for, I say, upper class. And then down here, what this is, these are the weights for different years, starting from 1916 up through 1923. So what you can see for upper class children is that in 1916, they're slightly below what they had been in 1914. They go along. They hit their nadir in 1920. So this is when they are doing the very worst in terms of weight. And then there's a recovery. By the time when my data ends, 1923, they've not yet reached their pre-war standards. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay? Not? Okay? Then this next graph, this is for middle class children. So this dashed line here, this is, you can think of this would be the average weight before the war, before any impact. What you see in 1916, they're just slightly below what they'd been before. They hit their nadir in 1919. They're kind of bouncing around. By 1922, they've almost reached their pre-war standard. By 1923, they've just surpassed it, so they're doing slightly better. If we look at lower class children, I should say what's sad about this is that these dashed lines here, they're just showing us inequality, right? Again, there's no reason that they should all be the same. I mean, that's what we would hope for, I think, in society today, that to be so poor that your growth is stunted, that's separate from everybody else is I think, very sad. So poor kids 1916, they're doing slightly above what they had before the war. 1917, they're doing worse. They hit their nadir in 1918. And they can afford to lose the least, but they lose the most. So they do the worst first. So there's a step. So poor kids hit their worst in 1918, middle class children in 1919, upper class children in 1920. What's interesting about lower class children, though, that surprised me a lot, and I spent a couple of years going back to the archives to try to understand this. This is where I got into the international aid data, is that they have a sharp recovery. That by 1920, they do slightly better. It's not statistically significant, but they're doing slightly better than they had before the war. This is at the same time where upper class children are doing their very worst. The data I have continues. So by 1921, they're doing better than they had before the war. 22, but 23, by the time the data by the time my data ends, they're doing so much better than they had before the war. So just visually, you can see the inequality. If you look at these three lines before the war, what we see is that the war exasperated this inequality. But once the war ended and international food aid comes in, there's other things going on, it's reduced. And this surprised me for many reasons. One, remember that Germany, they get a whole new government, right? Their government ends, they get a new type of government. You have hyperinflation, it starts during the war, it hit its high in 1923. So it's surprising in some ways that poor children would do the best. There's also some reason to think if you're on a set salary, if you're middle class, then with inflation that's not going to change. But this is an important graph. This shows a lot of the story. Just looking at the time, I have a similar one for height. I'm going to move on. I'm just going to say, if you think about it, weight, you're going to see that a more immediate impact. Height is a little bit delayed in terms of you get the food, it takes longer to grow. But you see similar stuff for height. I want to bring this back now to the qualitative sources. What's so fun about being an economic historian is that you get to use different parts of your brain to try to understand the past. So this is from Lena Richter. She published this in 1919. It was translated into Swedish. And what she suggests is that, I'll just read it. School doctors and nurses all agreed that there were no serious results to be seen in the children. This was, as a municipal doctor in Schimmitz writes, mainly due to the self-sacrifice of the parents, and especially of the mothers, and their anxiety for their children. If one looks at the women, worn away to skin and bone, with seamed and careworn faces, one knows where the portion of food assigned to them is really gone. Well, this sounds really nice, but let's be critical. It could just be leftover Victorian era ideals of motherhood. People weren't hungry because the moms sacrificed. But I was actually able to find a data set that allows me to test this. This data set was found by another historian about 30 years ago. What they did is they looked at total calories. Actually, I should back up. The data set is unique because it has people divided into families. So we know the anthropometric background of each person in a set family, and also how many calories that family got per person per day for a given week. So I just graphed that, and what you can see is that the average is about 1,900 calories, maybe 1,950 calories. If anybody on here has ever been on a diet, that's doable. You're not going to fall over with 1,900 calories. If you're eating that for a long time, though, you're not going to gain a lot of weight. But this makes a couple of assumptions. Here's a close-up of the data. To the left, these are all the observations for a given week of the family. I also know their occupation, their age, so it's really helpful to divide this up. But what this assumes by taking the average calories consumed is that, first of all, it assumes that there's equal distribution between households. Just thinking about that graph I showed you a couple slides ago with the inequality, that assumption that families are eating the same amount of food is not a very fair assumption. The second is that it assumes that there were that calories were allocated equally within families. I'm going to show you a messy graph. This is deliberate. What this is basically is I just graphed total calories per person, per family, over time. What you can see is that some families, they're doing great. They're well above 2,000 calories, but some are doing quite poorly. And if you're living on 1,400 calories a week, that's pretty hard. Especially if we go back, remember that they ran out of coal as early as the winter of 1916, 1917. This would be really hard, to stay warm, to have enough calories, to have energy to do stuff. So this is one reason why taking that average doesn't tell the whole story. But then that second assumption I told you about, here's a neater way to look at that graph. Let me just show this quickly. So what you can see is that if, assuming that calories were distributed equally within a household, you have over 15% of families in 1917 in Leipzig that are at the sedentary level. What that means is that you don't have enough energy to leave your house, to go out and gather food. What you want is the vigorous. This means you should have enough calories to do what you need to do. So this is very sad. But again, remember I told you that the data is also, I've got anthropometric data for each person in the family, even though the calories have been averaged. So what I did is I thought about how to use this data, and I ended up using information from the World Health Organization and the Food and Agricultural Organization. They have something that's called chronic energy deficiency, or CED. The idea being that if a person has a BMI below a certain number, that's going to affect their ability to function. One thing that's frustrating, you'll see when you do your own research, is that people have different cutoffs. So rather than choose one, I'm showing you both of them. So depending on what you look at, in 1917, the sample size is small, I should point out. This is for women ages 20 to 40. So these would be the mothers of the data set from Leipzig. What you see is that up 30% if you use the FAO were suffering from CED, or perhaps 48% if you use the World Health Organization. The WHO is the more recent, but again, I'm showing both of them. It goes down if you look for 1918, 40%. Going back to this table, obviously, if you have 40% of women aged 20 to 40 who are suffering from chronic energy deficiency, then this shows that family calories are not divided equally within a family. The reason why I don't have a graph like this for men of the same ages or older is, one, the sample's smaller, but there are still men, but not a single man in the study suffered from chronic energy deficiency for the entire period. So the suggestion that women suffered and sacrificed for their children, I argue this is evidence that this was not just a Victorian, let's think about our great moms. This was actually a real thing. And what's so sad in the data is that what you see is that women are sacrificing for their children, but there's only so much you can sacrifice before you're going to either die yourself or not be able to function. So they bottom out, and then the children go down. Very quickly, I'll just talk a couple more minutes. The U.S. was this is shifting gears, the U.S. was in a unique position during the war and after the war because of our agricultural prowess. So under Herbert Hoover, he was U.S. Food Administration, agricultural input expanded quite a bit, and during the war we then sent that surplus to our allies once we joined the war. And then once the war ended, it stopped before some people were expecting it to. There was a surplus of food supplies in the United States. This is just one picture of many. These children over here, they're the children of Europe. This is Uncle Sam. This is Herbert Hoover. You can see on his jacket it says Hoover, in case you weren't sure. He's standing in front of a large supply of foodstuffs, and he's tugging on Uncle Sam's shoulder, saying, we've got to feed these people. Over here is a giant wolf. We see this in a lot of different images at the time, representing want, famine, and winter, also labeled winter, is wafting in the background. This is this idea we've got to get food into Europe. What happens though is, remember, Germany, they were our enemy during the First World War, so there were lots of people who talked about the moral economy of aid, and the idea some argued that allies, our friends, should be fed first, then the neutrals, and last our enemies. Germany was not the only hungry country in Europe, especially Eastern Europe. There were a lot of really hungry people. What Herbert Hoover did, and others, although it was led by Hoover, is he came up with all of these different ways to try to convince people to send aid to Germany. He had slogans published widely such as, "I don't have any German enemies under the age of 6. We've never been at war with women and children." These were published widely, and by focusing on children, then he was able to convince many to then see the German clause and give food to children. Because even if Germans had been our enemies, children were not responsible for that. And it worked. I mentioned before that the Quakers alone sent 1.1 million, were feeding 1.1 million children a day. Part of this, they didn't have enough money, but part of this was actually funded quietly by the US government because it was unpopular. for some years to give food to Germany. The government under Herbert Hoover, they basically made the Quakers the face of aid. Quakers in the United States had come over, not from Germany, had not come from Germany. They were seen as very American. They were pacifists. And so it was a genius thing. Their aid organization, the American Friends Service Committee, started in 1917. So this is a photograph of a warehouse in Hamburg. This is just food for German children. I want to read you some letters quickly, just to show you the different voices that we see. This top one is from a 10-year-old girl, Adelheid Baird in Darmstadt. She says, and I translated these, "Dear Quakers, I've been sick for a few days, and then it came to me that I could write to you sometime. I got a jacket from you that is very beautiful. I never thought that I would someday own such a beautiful jacket. I only wear it on Sundays. This winter was really cold for us, and there was a lot of snow. I was sledding a lot, but now I can't go sledding because I am sick. We are refugees and do not have our own home. We would also not have had coal if this one good Quaker had not driven with us his car and brought the coal. My father died, but our aunt works for the Red Cross. She gets together with the Quakers a lot, and she tells us a lot about you." This letter to me just sounds really authentic, and you can see this little girl's personality. She's suffering a lot, but she still is able to see, a lot of positive things in her life. She talks about sledding. On the back of the letter is a giant cherry tree. An old woman is underneath, and then there's a sun with a big smile shining down on the scene. It's just such a hopeful, positive thing, and I think many children would have felt this way. Below, I've got another example of a letter, which I think is also authentic and also represents different types of feelings that some would have felt. This is from Matilda Endres in Munich. She says, Dear children of America, a German girl, a Munich child, greets you today for the first time. You will have already often heard that Germany, especially Munich, suffers great need. I daily enjoy the Quaker food. From my heart, I'm happy every day I have this meal. The war brought us this difficult fate. We Munich children are right emaciated, and you, dear American children, have so much and are so rich. I know well that you do a lot for us. If you could see such children, you would certainly have sympathy for us. Unfortunately, we can't see you, and you can't see us. I know well you do a lot. I think a lot of German children, they would have seen their suffering as being caused by the Americans. And this comes out, the sort of expectation, you made us hungry, we want food. And so there are different emotions that come out. We also see pictures. This is a drawing of a little boy, and he's on the front, it's a school. And what you can see are these children, they have two things in their hands. One, I believe, is a feeding card. The other is what they would use to get the food. They'd bring their own utensils and bowls. Here are adults. I can tell they're adults because they're twice the size of their humans in the drawing with hats. And what they would do would then check the feeding card. Children had to eat food in the feeding center. They couldn't take it out with them, which was a really smart rule, because maybe they would have wanted to share it with their family or their friends. Maybe it would have been stolen. But because they were selected, they were the ones that needed to get the food. Here's another drawing from an older child. You can see more clearly they're holding up their cards, and they've got their bowl to get the food, which they would then bring. So this is just a quick film. I found in the archives in Philadelphia. I know how many calories children were being fed. And I know what they were eating. The most popular meal was a sort of chocolate rice pudding soup that consisted of lard, sugar, rice, and condensed milk. And this was extremely popular. Let's see. I guess I should talk about the film. So the children are being fed. Here we have a few children that are eating their meal. It could be the chocolate soup. Another popular meal were beans. And they would also shipped over flour, so they'd have a roll, usually with whatever they were eating. He's holding up his feeding card, very proud. This was a really valuable thing to have, a feeding card at the time. This meant he got food. He's probably suffering from rickets. His friend comes and picks him up on the way that he wouldn't have recovered from later on. Just to show you a couple more pictures, there are actually thousands of these that I discovered in Switzerland and also in the United States. This is a fun one. So cacao for Deutsche Kinder. Chocolate for German children. You can tell that our little subject has been eating it because next to him is his spoon with chocolate pouring out of the bowl. And then he says to his friend, Aus Amerika schmeckt das wunderbar. From America, it tastes wonderful. And the little boy in the corner says, I believe you. So this is drawn by an 11-year-old. There's also a lot of evidence of children actually being measured. So I mentioned that people were measured before the war, during the war, after the war. This is a picture of a kid being drawn. You can see scales back behind if you're not sure. Being weighed. Here's another photo, another drawing. This kid, I think he's a bit too plump. He's on the scale. Maybe he doesn't qualify for the Quaker food. They wrote poems about wanting to be found small. They wrote songs, because if you were small, if you were in these 4 categories, if you were the bottom 2, then you would get access to this Quaker food. So they wanted to be found small enough to get the food. They then wrote about recovering and how much bigger they were. This is just a child of drawing some food. I'll skip that. Another theme that comes out a lot in the different images is the Quaker food before and after. So this is the girl before the Quaker food comes, during, afterwards. Not only is she getting fatter, she's getting happier. Her hair is getting bigger. Her hair bows are getting larger. This over here says Quaker Speise. You can't quite read it. So it's a big pot of Quaker soup. This is another great one. Similar idea, before and after. Before, he's just this weak little guy coming to get his food. Afterwards, these are weights. We can imagine he's just going to lift them up and start pumping weights, jump up on the bar. He's literally popping out of his lederhosen. Just to do a close-up on these, giant smile after the Quaker food comes. Before, he's quite unhappy. There were also a lot of religious themes I thought might be interesting to people here. There were a series of drawings. These are all from a specific school. We know this because they're drawing the same scene. They're also in the same folder in the archives. But what they're doing is they're quoting scriptures from the New Testament, encouraging givers. So we have, my little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue but in deed and truth, from John 3:18. For God loveth the cheerful giver. For I was hungered and you gave me meat. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. So these have the dual purpose of thanking the Quakers for giving them food, also with the hopes that this food aid would continue. But there's also letters that are more personal, that weren't done at school, that represent religion. So this is from an orphan. She's been getting Quaker food for an entire year. She talks about how she's still not quite heavy enough. If you do a close-up on this, in her hand, the angel's hand, it says America Speisung, so America food. And then down below, we've got the scripture, glory to God in the highest and goodwill toward men. And in her letter, it's just beautiful. She's just thanking the Quakers for the food, and she's thanking God as well, very specifically. Today, most schools are more secular. Maybe not BYU. We started with the prayer, which made me happy. But 100 years ago, people would have had a much greater literacy in terms of scripture and religion. It wasn't just the Quakers. So I mentioned also that they were supposed to feed. It wasn't just Christian background, I should say. Christians got food. They had to feed according to need. So here again we have before and after, frowning. Here he is fat, smiling, same kid. And what's so interesting is over here. So in Latin above we have this bell, pax, so peace. And then down below the Star of David with shalom written in the center of the Star of David across of. I use this as evidence to suggest that the Quakers actually did feed people based on need, not solely on their background. In terms of religion, just looking at the data I showed you earlier with poor kids growing the quickest, that's because they suffered the most, so they had greater access to this food. And that's it. My mom gives the book a great thumbs up. If there's any questions, happy to entertain them. So thank you.
If you have a question, please come to the microphone so it's being recorded. People can hear the question as well as the answer. We know some of you will have to leave for class here in just a few minutes. That's why please do so quietly. But we'll stay here for any questions. So please tell us who you are, what you're studying, and
All
your
right.
question.
My name is John Larson, and I am studying my generals as of right now.
Great.
So you mentioned a lot about women and children during those times starving. Were there any men also starving, or were they pretty much just kind of taking whatever food was available?
Thanks for that question. So starving is a technical word. I would say hungry, because yes, there were. So data on institutions. So for example, prisons where people didn't have access to additional calories from a black market. We can see that they're hungry, but often the state chose to feed military over civilians. This could be another reason why you could argue, if you wanted to, why a blockade might be a valid strategy, because it's not the elites, it's not the government that goes hungry. So in order to fight the war, military men got more food. In my sample, though, with children, there doesn't seem to be a bias between boys and girls. So this seems to have become later. I also want to just mention some economic theory. there could be practical reasons, very good reasons, for feeding a male bread earner rather than a female 100 years ago. So we think about society now, typically men and women unfortunately don't get paid the same amount for jobs that they do. This was even worse 100 years ago. So if you're in a society where food is limited and your income is limited and you don't have enough food, it makes a lot of sense to feed the person who can go out and earn the most money to then come back and be able to divide that pie with at least some people in the household. So I could say a lot about that. Does it also relate to love? I think so as well. I think women sacrifice for their children. But if you have to choose who are we going to feed in this household, if you can choose feed someone who can then go out and earn money. Another example of this is the work by Jane Humphreys, Deborah Oxley. They look at the Industrial Revolution, not a time of war, but in a time when there are a lot of hungry people. And we see the same thing. Men often have access to greater resources. Knowing exactly the reasons why we have these theories, but we can see why it makes sense. So thanks. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ashley. I'm studying exercise and wellness and Portuguese. I have a question and then also like a slight comment.
Sure.
My first question is kind of general. What got you into studying about the blockade and, just kind of proving that Germans suffered so much from it?
So I was actually interested in the idea of black markets from my master's thesis, and I got an idea from a book I read by Abner Offer, where black markets are really hard to measure because people don't normally keep beautiful records about all the illegal activity they did. Those are hard to find now. And so the original idea was maybe if we look at people's body weights, that's something that can tell me about black markets. If you have rationing, people who are gaining weight, who have a certain background, that might be interesting to find out. So that was the initial idea. And then I was able to find so much data after living in Germany for half a year that I realized I could answer a much bigger question, which is this 100-year-long debate in terms of what was the effect of a blockade on siblings. So
that's cool.
That was it.
My other thing was just, you mentioned that one book that was published in Portugal. I'm a Portuguese major, and I was just wondering if there's a reason it's in Spanish, the title of the book.
I don't know.
Okay, just wondering.
Maybe the company at the time, so I don't know. But
okay,
yeah,
cool.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Miranda Lape. I'm a Latin American Studies major.
Hi.
I was wondering, as you kind of then took up interest in this topic and began to research, were there any kind of previous ideas or thoughts you had going into it that turned out to be totally different? Pardon. You actually saw data and stuff?
I think one of the most surprising things for me was when I got those graphs back, when I ran the regressions. I wasn't expecting, I originally didn't actually separate them out by school type. I just ran the regression on all of the data. And I saw the strong recovery for children. And the reason it didn't make sense is that in the newspapers, a lot of people were writing in the reports, they were saying that they were more hungry after the war ended. And that surprised me. It wasn't until I separated out the data into social class and then went back to the archives, thought about the biases. The people who were writing these reports were the elites, and like I showed you, for them, it was worse. They hit their nadir in 1920, but I only saw that after I separated out the data. The other big surprise for me is trying to understand this growth curve. I mean, it's not just food aid, but it's a lot that was sent over there. I had to figure out those numbers. There was just a little bit in the literature that, Save the Children was over there, but I didn't know how much, and so to get the scale to figure out that was a big surprise. But I think the biggest surprise was just this strong recovery in a period of hyperinflation when you have a new government, new currency. That was surprising for me. That I had to. It was fun. I had to go back and try to understand it. So
Thank
thanks.
you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ronald Weaver. I'm a family life and psychology major. So I saw that you had the information of the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class through World War I. And I know that Germany had lots of other wars, like the Spanish Civil War, the German Revolution. Is there any data from World War II of that time, of when they had hunger, or did that, because I saw in 1923 it started to increase in that line. Did it decrease around that time when they had World War II? Did it increase at all?
That's a great question. In terms of data that I have, I've been able to discover data for a single city in Germany that goes from before the war up to 1960.
Okay.
I haven't analyzed it yet, but that's something I want to do in the future. So thanks.
Thank you.
It's a good reminder to do that. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Leslie Warner. I'm a genetics major studying genetics. My question is, you mentioned how after this war that they had more of an even outcome later on. So I was wondering how this starvation affected different classes, and especially just children who grew up later, and if that had any effect on Germany from then on.
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of your question again? What do you mean by later?
After the war, how there was not as much of a divide between social classes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So in terms of the statistics, I just have the years that I showed you that I've analyzed. I gave this. I mean, what I've been hoping to find, which I haven't found, are somebody's records or diaries from the 40s where they talk about being fed. You know, I showed that Nazi propaganda, which is a sort of a weird thing to do. I'm surprised you guys didn't make faces more. What's interesting about the Nazi propaganda is they talk all about the hunger, but they totally fail to mention anything about this massive, massive international aid that came in, food aid. And the international aid, you know, the Quakers were there longer. Americans were feeding German children longer than the war had even lasted. And I believe that they would have remembered that. Just because they were fed for a minimum of a month, many for years, they'd have to go to a special place, they'd have to eat that. And I think, I mean, I need to be careful because I don't have the records, but I just have to think that would stay in people's memories. And I wonder, you know, if you're reading this Nazi propaganda and you'd been a child who'd been fed, if you would also remember that you had been fed by these Quakers. And how that may have affected, I should be careful, but you know, Americans in World War II, prisoners, they were treated better than other countries, and I wonder if that's related. But this is just supposition on my part.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Gavin Carnes. I'm a sophomore and I'm studying statistics.
Oh, great.
And I just had a question. It may just be my ignorance, and it kind of ties in with your previous response. But what was the German government like doing at this time? Were they, you know, requesting for help as well? We saw a lot of things from the citizens of Germany, but not necessarily from the government.
Thanks. This is a great question. So they're doing a few things. One, they trust the Quakers so much that they say, we'll transport any of your food for free across our country. If you can get it into Hamburg, we'll pay for the trains to get it around. And they form a ministry on aid, on foreign aid. There's so much aid coming in. I mentioned the U.S., we're the largest, but there's aid coming in from all over, from Africa, from Asia, from the United States, from other parts of Europe. And so they're trying to categorize that. Maybe this won't seem funny to you, but they publish these pamphlets where they're basically saying, we need foreign aid, but also we're totally self-sufficient. So there's sort of this, you can just read, like, you're just thinking all these poor people are trying to, like, sound positive, but they want the food to keep coming. And one thing they do, which I found a little bit funny, is they look at German taxes, and they use all German taxes to say, look, we're helping ourselves. Here's all of these taxes that we're collecting. Here are all of these taxes that we are collecting, then do different things. But they're allowing food to be transported freely. They're sending letters to Herbert Hoover, to the newspapers in the U.S., thanking the U.S. people. So they're happy this is coming through.
Okay.
They also don't want to look totally dependent as a country.
I
so
see.
You get these sort of weird things that come out.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Cranny. I'm an international relations major. You talked a lot about how the Quakers fed the children in Germany, but you also showed evidence that the women were severely undernourished. Did the Quakers catch on to that? Were there programs to help feed older people besides those school children, or just mostly the school children?
Thanks. There were definitely programs to feed other people in Germany. So you had some who were feeding academics, the starving academics. There were groups that were feeding them. They were also hungry. Everybody's hungry. But the Quakers really focused on children. And there was, in their internal reports, they're talking about how maybe they should feed other people, but they just decide, we can do this well, we're only going to feed children. That included, however, in some places, nursing mothers pregnant women and women that had babies up to the age of 2. But otherwise, they weren't, the Quakers at least were not giving any aid to women. But they could have gotten it from different places, maybe.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Mari.
Hi, my name is Mari McLeod. I'm not currently a student, but I still have a question. You mentioned at the beginning the sort of rubbish government schemes so that the import and the food and what was grown wasn't a great resource. Were people in the country a little bit better off, or was it just widespread in cities and country that everyone needed aid?
I'm so glad you asked that. I'm just going to quickly go here. Here's this question. Were there urban and rural differences in the nutritional status of school children? This plugs into a big debate. So at the time, again, I showed you the biggest difference had to do with wealth. But what people are talking about for the most part are urban-rural divides. And in the cities, a lot of people complained about greedy German farmers who are keeping all their food stuff to themselves and not sharing. And this is a bit unfortunate. So I was, in rural areas, they collect less data than in big cities. But I was able to find data for Strasbourg, which was part of Germany. And what you see is that if you look at social class, so for these ones, the data was organized totally by wealth. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1 were the wealthiest kids' schools. 6 were the poorest schools. Once you control for that, there's no urban and rural difference whatsoever.
Okay.
Wealth is what matters. So it's unfortunate because there's this big fight going on between them, and what they should have been focusing on was maybe the government allowing the military to requisition whatever they wanted, and also these social divides between the wealthy and poor. So great question. Thanks. I'm happy I could show the slide.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Alma West. I'm currently an undeclared major, but when you were talking about the data that you used from schools to run like these tests, do you know if like the U.S. collects similar data, and then if not, how could we be more effective at like collecting that data so we can use it for like the future to study?
So
like, our conditions now?
Here's a problem that we have right now in the U.S. is that we have people in this country, we have refugees, immigrants, and we don't even know who they are. So we can't even figure out how hungry they may or may not be, or how improved they are or are not, because we don't know who they are. So we can't take their records to know their height or their weight. So right now, I think this is really sad. In terms of measuring at school, I've heard some people tell me, like my mom's age, they were measured at their schools. I don't think this happens regularly now, at least at most schools. But I think it's a shame that we can't even talk about possible divides between women and children or families, or how those change, because we can't collect the data because we don't have records of who they are.
Yeah. And then would you have like any ideas on how we could possibly go about doing that, especially with the conditions of today? Just based on you've seen like examples in your study on how they did
at
it.
a minimum, we need to know who people are, and then we should start taking these measurements. I mean, a basic way would be to, when they first come to the country, know who they are, keep track of them, keep track of the children, measure them, and then take measurements throughout. That would be a great way of just knowing what issues may or may not be, and then respond. I mean, I'm just talking about the U.S., but other places too. We need to think about institutions that already exist that we can plug into anywhere in the world. So I didn't mention Save the Children. They do good, and I think I'm pro food aid for children, whoever it comes from. They're a lot less effective than the Quakers. The big reason is that they don't want to work with Germans. They don't trust them. There's internal reports about how we don't want to hire any Germans because they might steal the food. Maybe that's you can understand the bias. They're very recent enemies. This was started in England. But it takes them, they've got all the food, they've got the resources. It takes them 9 additional months after they're ready to go to opening up a feeding center in Leipzig, because they have to wait until they can find a Swedish woman living there to hire. So in terms of thinking about today, we need to think about institutions that we can plug into that already exist, like the Quakers do with feeding different people, how to get in there. And that's going to be dependent on location and part of the world, I think. So we need experts on different places to do it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, my name's Ruth Eldridge. I have a methodological question and a personal question. I hope those are okay. First, I'm just really fascinated by the way that you've presented both qualitative and quantitative data in your work, and that's not something I see done very well or very often in a lot of fields. And I wonder if you can kind of speak to maybe some of the benefits or drawbacks of that, and also. I've never cried before at an academic lecture, and so I'm wondering. Guys, I have no excuses. I'm wondering just how you deal with the emotional content of your subject matter, and both like for good or ill, and how that might kind of affect the way and the subjects that you choose for your work.
Thanks a lot, Ruth. To answer the first question, Dr. Pierre, I did comparative literature at BYU, which was so great because it's so ambitious. Ideally, we would know all languages, do everything, which is impossible, but that ambition, I think, is worthwhile. I think of statistics or a language or any different methodology is just a different tool. So because I know German, I'm able to read these German sources. Because I know how to make econometric models, I can then use the statistics. I would argue that if you just, the scope matters. If we just ignored all the statistics, then you're missing a big part of the story. So in terms of using different methodologies, I'm excited and happy to use any tool I can to try to understand what was going on. It's harder because you've got to, learning these things takes time. Learning a language takes time. Learning the methodology takes time. But if you do it, then you can answer a lot of questions that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. Another argument I would make is that when you have totally different types of sources and methodologies pointing to a similar conclusion, then that suggests that the result is robust. So when the qualitative sources, which I just showed a few of them, match with the quantitative analysis, that gives me confidence that I might be on the right track. So I would say for that, it's worth it. In terms of dealing with the emotional, I really care about these people. And sometimes I speak in the present tense, which is a problem. I try not to, but I get so into it that I kind of imagine these, the first part of the book for me is quite sad because I go over the deprivation. But looking at this international aid gives me a lot of hope. Thinking of using these types of tools as a way of measuring effectiveness of food aid, I think is fantastic. A lot of times, and you'll probably know this in your classes, people can skip very quickly from the way that we talk about effectiveness of aid. So this is an exaggeration, but the idea that, well, we've been sending aid to Africa for a long time, but they're still a poor country, what's the point? What that does is you skip over the immediate people whose lives were blessed, who are saved. So if you use a source like this, if you have children to see who's getting aid, this can help slow us down. Even if countries are poor later on, who's being helped in the short term? So in terms of being positive, I guess that gives me optimism. Thanks, Ruth.
Hi, my name is Aiden Houston. I'm a European Studies major. So for those of us that know you personally, Mary, we know that you're a talented researcher, but also a very wise person. That's something that I have valued, and I think you've shown that in the last couple of answers to the last couple of questions. So I was just wondering, what are some of the broader personal takeaways, and you've just addressed this briefly, but that you've gotten from this research, not only about cross-cultural aid, but also about our role as researchers and the impact that we can make from doing this kind of research?
Thanks. I think that being able to be specific in suffering is a way of showing respect. So instead of just saying, oh yeah, they were hungry, which maybe people would agree with, being able to say who was hungry, how hungry they were, when they were hungry, is a way of showing respect for other people. And that could translate in if you're a historian or if you're doing research currently. The more specific we can be, I think the more Christ-like we can be. Maybe I can say that at BYU, because these were real people. They lived. They suffered a lot. There are people now who are suffering, and if we can just get really specific on their suffering and also on their recovery, that that's also why I tried to show some of these letters and pictures and videos, is just to, you can get lost in the statistics sometimes. And even in our own research that you're doing, whatever field, if you're working with anything related to actual people, just keep that in mind. And I think when you do your research, that would be another plug for reasons why it's helpful to have qualitative and quantitative methods in what you're doing at the same time. I forgot the rest of the question. Did I answer it? Sort of?
Great.
Okay.
This will be the last question.
Okay.
Hey, my name's Kenton Davis. I'm an international relations major. And I guess one of the things I thought was really interesting in the data was just that the lower classes were better off than they were before the war, whereas the upper classes were not.
Yeah.
Was that because the Quakers were targeting like the less healthy groups in general, you think?
They're targeting those who were the worst, who were the hungriest. Poor children in the data, they suffered the most. So they weren't targeting the poorest, they were targeting those that were the worst off. And because they suffered the most, then they're getting the most aid. There's other things going in play besides food aid, though that seems to be the biggest impact. But that would be it.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you.